Welcome to the third episode of our pre-concert talk series. Today's episode was recorded prior to the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment concert on the 25th of February 2026. Today we have Bob Samuel from the Open University talking all about Mozart's world.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming along to this talk. I've been to the Anvil before. I know that I get an enthusiastic and also a full audience for these. So I've been gratified to see it again this evening. Thank you very much indeed. My name is Bob Samuels. I work for the Open University. I teach for the music department there. And many people, I always start by saying that, partly because this is part of my job. It's probably the bit I enjoy most, which is what we call public engagement, talking to people who aren't inside the university system about things that we have discovered in our work in the university system. So that's the idea behind tonight's talk. Right, Mozart's World is the title that the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment have given tonight. And so I thought we might talk a little bit about Mozart's world, late 18th century Vienna, the world of the early concert symphony in the form in which we now think of it today, the symphony concert and so on. Mozart's one of the first composers to be involved with writing that kind of work, as I'll talk about a little more as we go on. And it's also the world of the professional musician in the time of Mozart. And we often tend to forget that Mozart was a self-employed, freelance, professional musician, making a living for himself without the direct patronage of a powerful noble, as his friend and mentor Haydn had. He worked for the Esterházy family, for Prince Esterházy, one of the wealthiest nobles in Austria and Hungary at the time. Mozart didn't. He left the service of the Archbishop of Salzburg, whom he got on with very badly, and you may know the famous story, which is in a letter by Mozart, I think, to his father, saying, "I was unceremoniously dispatched with a kick up the backside." Quite possibly literally true, but anyway, after that, he went and settled in Vienna permanently. He married, he brought up a family there, and that's the world which we want a little window into as we talk about the concert program this evening. And after all, I think it's a kind of corrective. It's something we need to do from time to time, certainly, because we tend to put Mozart on a pedestal, hence my picture. That is a picture of Mozart literally on a pedestal. It's a kind of gesture, it's a statement. This is in Salzburg, where he was born. It's in the Mozartplatz in Salzburg, in fact, and it was erected in 1844. Right in the middle of the 19th century, by which time Mozart was, of course, celebrated as one of the, not just the greatest Austrian or German Austrian composers, but one of the greatest composers of all time. And he was thought of as a kind of godlike status. I don't know if you can see, he's holding a pen in his hand, or possibly a pencil. He is remembered fundamentally as a composer, someone who writes music. Now, as a working musician, he was most famous as someone who played music. He was a virtuoso pianist. He was also a very fine violinist. He led orchestras from the violin. He played his own piano concertos, one of his principal ways making an income. But today, or by the middle of the 19th century, 50 years after his death, he was remembered as a composer, someone who wrote music, hence the writing tool in his hand. And I'm not sure exactly what the clothing is. It's hard to tell, especially it's obviously beloved by the pigeons of Salzburg as well. But it looks awfully like a toga. That cloak wrapped around him. I'm sure whether it's he's meant to be dressed in classical costume or not. I think it's meant to make us think of that kind of noble Roman, almost godlike figure. He is above the mere mortals. He is with the realm of the gods. That is putting Mozart on a pedestal, all right. And we tend to do that particularly with these three symphonies, the last three symphonies that he wrote, and some of his most famous works, of course. Keep the pedestal just in the background for a little while. Now, the way in which the Mozart kind of mythology has developed, the way in which he's popularly thought of, and I mean right up to the day, especially if you read program notes, not the excellent program notes I wrote myself for this evening, of course, but program notes quite often, or CD liner notes if you still buy and collect CDs, which I know is going out of fashion nowadays, but in the popular presence, we think of Mozart as a genius touched by the gods. The pure inspiration flowed out of him. And that was particularly true of these three symphonies, which for a long time, and in fact there is no direct evidence that Mozart actually heard any of them played. And for a long time it was suspected that maybe he just wrote them, he wrote them all together in the matter of maybe 7 or 8 weeks across one summer in 1788. So, several years before the end of his life, and he was in very good health right up to the end. He was ill in the last year of his life. He had no intimation that they were going to be his last by any means. And why did he write them? Well, one of my favourite books about Mozart, Alfred Einstein's magisterial survey of his work from 1946. He's a little bit cautious about saying, but he says, "We know next to nothing about the occasion for writing these works. It's strange that Mozart should have written symphonies during the summer." Now, I'm not sure why it's strange, to be honest, but Einstein thought that it was. It's possible that Mozart never conducted these 3 symphonies and never heard them. But this is perhaps symbolic of their position in the history of music itself and of human endeavour, representing no occasion, no immediate purpose, but an appeal to eternity. Okay, now you couldn't get a clearer kind of expression of what I would say the Mozart myth is composed of. It's, of course, a long time, 80 years since those words were written. And in the meantime, we found out quite a lot more about Mozart. We know more about his day-to-day life, although it's still quite scanty, still quite scarce what information there is. It seems extremely unlikely that Mozart never heard these works. Extremely unlikely. But on the other hand, why did he write them? It's still very unclear. Now, I'm going to suggest a couple of reasons, which I think are quite likely, as to why Mozart, in the summer of 1788, should have spent most of his time writing these 3 absolutely fantastic works. He had just had to move house because he couldn't afford lodgings near the centre of Vienna. He'd moved into one of the suburbs. He says in a letter to a friend that actually it's much better in the suburbs. A, because it's a lot cheaper. That's good. And B, because it's much less noisy. I have more time to work, he says, with less distraction. It's interesting. So what he was doing with that less distracted time was working like crazy on these 3 symphonies. And it's a good question that Einstein asked. Why does he write 3 symphonies altogether over the course of one summer? Nevertheless, the myth has continued. This is a famous recording of these 3 works by Nicholas Arnoncourt. He wants to take the myth even to a further level. He says maybe these 3 works were written deliberately as a triptych. They are not just a single work, but they are what he calls Mozart's symphonic oratorium. Okay, they should be thought of as a 12-movement single work going on for nearly 2 hours, the length of an opera. And what does he say about them? These are in CD liner notes. From the E-flat major intrada, that's to the first of the 3 symphonies, number 39, we find ourselves setting out on a rocky road that recalls nothing so much as a psychological drama, and that heads ultimately to the mighty coda at the end of the final movement of the Jupiter Symphony. Okay, so he thinks these 3 works belong together and that you should definitely play them together, which we're going to do this evening. I must say that's not how they would have been played in the late 18th century, but no, that's his idea. He says, there is no going on after this work. As if this was the greatest work of all time, there was no way anyone could write music following Mozart or to follow Mozart. As we know, not quite true. So, is it just pure inspiration? Is it just the gods touching the genius and moving his hand across the manuscript paper? Or is there an element of self-promotion in that? And here I'm going to turn to a few elements of actual historical data. Historians like objective facts, things that we can look at. Now, there's a very good reason why we know very much less about Mozart's life in 1788 than we do almost his entire life up to that point. And that is because our main source for what Mozart did and thought about day to day, his day-to-day life, comes from his letters to his father. He wrote to Leopold Mozart constantly, whether things were going well or things were going badly, whether he and his father had fallen out over women or anything else, which they did quite frequently, or whether they were in good humour with each other, whether he was arguing for why he should be allowed to marry Constanza, which was a match that Leopold Mozart objected to. He was persuaded more or less by Mozart writing a letter saying, well, look, we've moved in together. It's going to be a scandal unless you give me permission now, which duly, rather grudgingly arrived, and their first baby was born 8-9 months later. It was quite a close-run thing. In the summer before this one, so in 1787, Mozart has hit the ground, as it were. He was now very celebrated not only as a great performer, great virtuoso, but also as a composer of operas. Don Giovanni was just being written, great success in its premiere in Prague. And Leopold died. And with Leopold's death, letters, of course, ceased. Not only that, but possibly to do with the death, Mozart rather fell out with his sister. She had moved away from Salzburg, and the letters to his sister also ceased from that point. They seem to have not wanted to be in touch with each other for a few years. So we have very, very little evidence. We don't have letters. So we have to fall back on other. We do have some letters, but to friends and so on, but not the letters we would like, where he talks about his music, about his art, about his thoughts and plans and so on. How about a newspaper? Well, we do have some of the newspapers. Here is the Wiener Zeitung, this is the Vienna newspaper. Here's the 2nd of April, 1788, okay, so that's the year in which these symphonies are going to get written. Mozart puts an advert in. He says, I have 3 new quintets for 2 violins, 2 violi, and a cello, which I offer by subscription. In other words, you pay him money to get the scores. Mozart has just started to get the idea that you could sell the scores of your music. He's selling it presumably to people who want to play it, or maybe to cognoscenti, connoisseurs, who just want to have it in score, okay? He's gone in for a deal, obviously, with a publisher to be able to do this, and he says, gives you the price, and says, so you can go and get these from Puchberg, that's a friend of his, at the Salentz's warehouse in the Hohe Markt. The work itself may also be had, okay. So you can put in a subscription, then you come back in July and you get 3 string quintets, brand new by Mozart, written out under his direction and so on. You may know Mozart's string quintets. They are magisterial. And again, he wrote several of them right at the end of towards the end of his life, just at this point in his career. It's a way of trying to make money out of being a composer, something very few people have been able to do previously. Okay. A couple of months later, this is a month, just a few days short of when he said they were going to be actually available to all those subscribers, in the same newspaper, he said, well, as the number of subscribers is still very small, I find myself obliged to postpone the publication of my 3 quintets until the 1st of January, 1789. Okay, another 18 months ahead. You may still subscribe for them, and that's very interesting. So Mozart, I mean, if you had a chance today to be the sole owner of a Mozart string quintet written in the late 1780s, I mean, these are some of the greatest works of chamber music ever composed. Very interesting, by the way, Mozart, he wrote 2. He'd written 2, I think, by the time he put this in. One is in E-flat major, one is in G minor. One is in C major, one is in G minor. And the third one, which he kind of cobbled together from a previous work eventually, so that he had 3 to present to the publisher later on, that is in E-flat major. Think of those keys, C major, G minor, E-flat major. Interesting, isn't it? He writes new substantial chamber works in the exact same 3 keys as the 3 symphonies he writes in the summer of 1788. So, Mozart is writing symphonies. He must have a reason for doing this. He almost never wrote completed works unless he knew he was going to perform them. He wrote piano concertos because he was going to perform in concert. And I suspect they may have something to do with a project which didn't quite come off, which was in the previous summer, partly urged by Haydn. Mozart had intended to go on a tour to London London, a great centre. Of course, London, one of the most important musical centres in the 1790s, I'd like to say. We tend to forget that, but incredibly important. And he was going to put on a series of concerts. Now, if you went to London and you had to put on a series of concerts featuring your own music, which undoubtedly he would have done, as Haydn did just a couple of years later, you would want to have some symphonies on that. Haydn always did. When Haydn got to London with 3 newly written symphonies under his belt and was told he needed at least 6 for the season ahead, he writes back to the Esterházy Palace, frantically saying, "Can you look out those other 3 symphonies I left behind? I'm going to need them," because he couldn't write them whilst he was actually on tour, of course. The reason that Mozart and Constanza never went to London in probably for the 7 to 8 season was that they couldn't get childcare. I don't know if any of you could sympathise with this, but they had a 4-year-old, Carl was 4, and they had a baby and sadly died. They had 2 babies actually in that year, both of whom died very shortly. They didn't live for more than a few months. But Leopold said he couldn't possibly look after the toddler whilst they went to London, and they couldn't find anybody else. So rather than packing the 4-year-old off to Salzburg for a few months whilst they got to London, they cancelled the trip. Maybe that's why these symphonies never got. But maybe he was writing for a proposed second trip of that sort. Quite likely, I think. Anyway, it is also very, very unlikely that Mozart did not use them subsequently. We don't have any actual definite evidence that he did, but the following year, 1789, he went on tour to Germany and put on a series of concerts across Germany featuring his own music. So here is a concert. This is in Leipzig in May 1789, okay? And there we know the concert was advertised. Herr Mozart, Kapellmeister in the Imperial and Royal Service in the Gewandhaus, okay, so the big concert hall in Leipzig, still there today. He says, Part 1, Symphony. Doesn't say which one, it's jolly annoying, someone sings, then Concerto on the Pianoforte, that's presumably his own. Symphony, jolly good. Part 2, Concerto on the Pianoforte, doesn't say which one, undoubtedly one of Mozart's though. Then Madame Duschek is going to sing again, then Fantasy on the piano. That means Mozart was going to improvise. He's going to improvise a fantasia at the keyboard. And then symphony, all right? Well, someone did suggest maybe these are the 3 symphonies, okay, that he'd written the previous summer. Did he take? I very much doubt that he would have put all 3 of them. And they take a long time to write. They're incredibly important things, I think if you're going to present a new grand symphony, I think you would just use 1 per concert, probably. So what I suspect Mozart was going to do, I suspect he did here, was he took one of his old symphonies, maybe the Paris Symphony, which he'd written a couple of years earlier, maybe the Prague Symphony, who knows, one of those recent ones, and he would have split it up. So he'd have played the first movement at the beginning of the first half, played the rest of it at the end of the first half. That was very, very popular. 18th century concert programs, I wish we put on the same programs today sometimes, with this mixture of concerto and singing and symphony played as an overture at the beginning, always, sometimes played as the big work at the end. Here, that's new. It's only now that the symphony is becoming more important. Until shortly before this period, it had always been called an overture. Symphony would always be played at the beginning of the first half. Sometimes one of its movements would be held back till the end of the first half as a kind of finale thing, or it would be played at the beginning of the second half. Now, it's obviously more important because it ends. So I reckon the last work in the programme was probably one of the 3 that he'd written the previous summer, maybe number 39 or 40 or 41, who knows which one. But we don't know. There is an account of this concert by somebody who went. He writes, he said, I went to this fantastic concert put on by Mozart. He said, it was very cold. He said, it went on for ages. He said, by the halfway through the second half, everybody was getting so cold they would refuse to stay any longer, so they never played the symphony that was meant to be the last work. So maybe this was going to be the premiere of the Jupiter Symphony, and it never happened. Who knows? Okay, but the next year, Frankfurt, 1719, and here's another concert. You see, Musikalisches Konzert. And here, again, this is a typical late 18th century concert program. Let me just translate those. A new grand symphony by Herr Mozart, okay, and a concerto on the piano played by Mozart. And in the second half, a concerto played by Mozart at the beginning of his own composition. There we are. Again. And at the end, a symphony. Well, I think probably one of those, possibly the new Grand Symphony at the beginning, was one of the ones that he'd written the previous year, almost certainly. Okay, we don't know which one, and we don't know how it went down, but it's very, very unlikely that it wasn't there. Here is another one, okay, 1791. This is not Frankfurt anymore, this is Vienna in 1791. A grand musical concert advertised in Vienna, 1791, so the last year of Mozart's life, and it consists of the following pieces. A grand symphony composed by Herr Mozart. You get the idea. You know, he did put these things on. He writes to a friend saying, I'm terribly hard up, can you lend me a quid? Well, actually, can you lend me rather more than a quid? I've got a concert series coming on in just a few weeks' time. I've already sold some tickets. By the time you forward me this, I'll be able to repay you with interest in 3 months' time. And he says that he's writing the symphonies that summer for that concert series. We don't have any evidence of what those concerts were, but it seems very unlikely he didn't have fairly good idea that they were going to take place. We don't know if they actually did. But here's another one, and again, a grand symphony composed by Mozart is the whole of the first half, it would seem. It seems extremely likely that Mozart did, in fact, hear one or more or all of these. And before I leave these, the other evidence for that being a Vienna concert is that there is a set of parts for the 40th, the G minor symphony, copied out, in which, and they've been proven, they've turned up, I can't remember where in Austria, and possibly they are in Salzburg, I can't remember, but they are clearly copied by Mozart's copyist in Vienna, very close to when the work was written. And they include clarinets. I do not know if we're going to have clarinets playing in the 40th symphony this evening. I suspect we will, because this is almost certainly Mozart's last thought. He rewrote the slow movement of the 40th symphony at some point after writing it, and he included clarinets in it and rewrote some passages to reflect that. Now, it seems almost impossible that he didn't do that for a specific performance where he had the instrument available. Maybe he didn't know whether or not... Clarinets were very new, you see. You might not know whether an orchestra would have them or not. So again, that's the last bit of scrap of historical detail, which makes me think that he probably did hear these works just as well, isn't it? Let's go to London. As I said, London, greatest musical city of the time. Let's go to Haydn in London, okay? And here is an advert for Haydn's concert, the last, in fact, of his season in 1795, which he described as one of the happiest years of his life. He spent the whole season in London being feted. He went there twice in 1790. He was in London when he heard of Mozart's death, actually, in late 1791, early 1792. He was devastated by that. And then he came back in 1794-5. This is the last concert of his last tour, as it were. Look at what he says they're playing again. It starts with an overture in manuscript. That means a new symphony. Okay, it's called an overture, but it's not. It's a symphony. In fact, we know, because Haydn noted down in his diary what was being played, we know that is a symphony. And then the end of the first half is a new overture. Again, that is, in fact, Haydn's 104th symphony, the very last he ever wrote, called the London Symphony. And he writes in his diary, I finished my 12th and last of my English symphonies. Okay, and he wrote 6 the first tour, 6 for the second tour, and they are the most important works, really, in these concert programs. And that's what so Haydn and Mozart, very important in kind of inventing this new idea that instead of having a piece with a flashy soloist, a concerto, or instead of having something which had a text which is being sung, you can have a piece which is just instruments alone as the main work. Concert, you call it a grand symphony to distinguish it from, lesser symphonies. And Haydn and then Mozart, possibly Mozart then Haydn, actually, because Mozart, I think, maybe the first to cotton on to this as a business opportunity. And they really start this. And of course, to go back to Vienna, conclude this little excursus into the history of the symphony with the figure whom is most associated with it. And that, of course, is Beethoven. Okay, here is a concert in Vienna, 1824, only 30 years later, not that much later, really, is it? Here we are, and that is the first part. The featured piece of music are the newest works of Herr Ludwig van Beethoven, okay? And here is a list of works. There's only 3 of them. A grand overture, which he'd written for the occasion. I can't remember which one that is. 3 grand hymns with solo voice and chorus. You have to get some singing in. You never have a concert without singing of some sort. And a grand symphony with finale featuring solo voices and chorus on Schiller's Ode to Joy. We know which one that was, okay? This is the premiere of Beethoven's last symphony. So in 30 years, it has gone from being something which Mozart isn't quite sure whether he can get a concert to put it up on him, but he's going to try, to being the centerpiece of Beethoven's great concerts and great work. Okay, so maybe, rather than pure inspiration, these are inspired works, no doubt about that, and rather than thinking of them as self-promotion, we think of the inspired self-promotion and hear these works all the way through. But I want to say, here are something to listen for in each of Mozart's last 3 symphonies. One thing in each symphony as a little thing. So you need to watch out for these bits when we get in. It's not going to be difficult for you to do that, I don't think so. So, first of all, something to listen for in Symphony 39 in E-flat major, K543, okay? There's the first page of the score. This is a remarkable work. It's the least talked about of the 3, but in many ways it's just as interesting as the other. Maybe least thought about because outwardly, ostensibly, it casts its eye back to the past and to tradition more than the other 2 do. The opening is really interesting. It starts with a slow introduction, okay? The 40th doesn't, and the Jupiter doesn't really either. But this one does. Haydn, in about half of his late symphonies, likes to start with a slow introduction. Mozart takes it up here, and he does exactly what he's meant to do, which he has a slow introduction which refers back to the French opera overture, okay? This call to attention with double-dotted rhythms. Ba, ba-dum, ba-dum, okay? This is meant to arrest your attention. It's adagio because this is a weighty, important work, okay? And being Mozart, he works this little rhythmic interest into everything that he writes. And Mozart's control of rhythm is absolutely extraordinary, and you'll see that again in a moment. So he takes it up immediately at half the speed, as it were, and it becomes a little tune, dum, dum, da, dum, dum, up in the top. Well, that's a sort of Mozart signature, that rhythm, that dotted rhythm, dum, dum, da, dum, dum. Lots of Mozart, he writes loads of melodies which have that somewhere in them, including quite a few in this very symphony, so watch out for that pervasive dotted rhythm. The rest of the symphony, having had this great sort of magisterial introduction, turns out to be a kind of homage to the style galant, to the kind of the way of writing music for instruments, which catches your attention, refers and takes you off into another world. Here is the great Nicholas Arncourt with his version of this opening. Okay, so that's something to listen for. It's right at the beginning, so you won't miss it. But that takes you back. It is something that refers to the past, but in order to announce its arrival in the present. And it says, this is the most important work you're going to hear this evening. Okay. Something to listen for then in K550, many people's favourite, the G minor symphony. Here's a picture of the opening theme. Well, we all know this tune. It's one of Mozart's best-known tunes, isn't it? I talked about rhythm a moment ago. I just want to show just how amazingly intricate and brilliant Mozart's control of rhythmic design is. Okay, we all know how this starts. Da-da-lum, 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 bum, okay? In other words, there's the first phrase, okay? And let's just think about that for a moment. It has 2 quavers and a crotchet, 2 shorts and a long. I want you to remember that pattern, short, short, long, because what happens immediately afterwards? Well, let's have a look at the first phrase. Da-da-lum, 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 bum. If you look at that carefully, you'll see there's one phrase, repeated, 2 short phrases, and then one that's a bit longer, a short, and then a short, then a long, just the same, okay? And My goodness, it does it the same, of course, because it repeats the phrase, and it does it again, like that, and it does it again, like that. And it doesn't. Then the last phrase of the tune, well, it has one much longer phrase that opens it, which it repeats, and it has an even longer phrase to close it and overlaps with it. So again, that's short, short, long. Okay, short, short, long, short, short, long, short, short, long. Okay, rather wonderful, isn't it? Yes, I can even take it a stage further because that's the sort of thing I like doing. This is music analysis, wonderful phrase, of course, and then it's repeated rhythmically exactly, and then it's followed by a longer third phrase, short, short, long. And if I wanted, I could probably make out an argument for this getting even larger and larger and larger. But for everybody to understand, the whole of the first phrase, done so effortlessly, you wouldn't perceive it until it's pointed out to you. And yet it's what gives that intensity and indeed that romanticism of expression. This symphony is all about romanticism. This symphony, more than anything other, or along with Don Giovanni, the opera, are the reasons why Mozart was called the greatest romantic composer by the first theorist to write a history of romanticism. It was written in the first decade of the 19th century. We think of romanticism being something that belongs in the middle of the 19th century. Oh no, it belongs at the end of the 18th century. And here is that very famous opening. Short, short, okay, well, you won't miss that tune when it comes, but you can think about, try and spot the way in which it kind of draws you in that way. And that's what gives it that intensity and of personal expression, as I say. Now I want to give you something to listen for in the Great Jupiter Symphony, the one that's got the nickname. Something to listen for in K551. Okay, well, this is from the very end. I started with the beginning of the first one. I'm going to end with the end of the last one. This is in the finale. These are the string parts only because they fit on the screen better. Now, this is famous because this is the moment at which Mozart shows that he can do the learned style as well as the romantic style, as well as the gallant style. And this is the learned style in that he gets all 6 components that he's used as melodies in the finale to come together simultaneously. So you have the tune with which the whole thing starts, dum, dum, da, dum, okay. And that just starts coming in the bass at the end of this passage. And then you get this that rhythm again. Dum da 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 dum bum ba da, that very distinctive Mozartian dotted rhythm. And yes, that comes in over there as well. And then you have dum 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 da da dum, another version of the dotted rhythm, dum 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 da da dum. Okay, very memorable tune, even though it's just a scale going up, isn't it? It's the rhythm that makes it memorable. And there that comes in there and over there, okay. And dum da 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 dum. Okay, there's that one. That comes in over there as well. And the last one, number 6, I think it is. Dum 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 dum. Okay. Ba bum bum ba. Right. This goes past in a flash. Okay, and you just but see if you can hear maybe 3 out of those 6 tunes all going at the same time. I'm going to play the bars that lead up to this moment. Pause. And then play the bars that are on the screen, okay? Here we go. Again, Nicholas Arnoncourt and the... why doesn't the OE record these 3 works? I can't get a CD of them. Okay, so you've heard them all going in counterpoints. You can hear in all different parts of the texture, some in the bass, some up here, some in the middle. And here is the passage we've got in front of us on the screen. See how many you can spot. fantastic, isn't it? I mean, it's so intricate, it's so effortless. And no wonder that this has set the stall out for symphonies that were going to follow for many, many decades thereafter. In many ways, Beethoven, of course, got hold of these as soon as Constanza did publish them in the 1790s. He got hold also of Haydn's London symphonies, and as soon as he could. And when he looked at the scores of both the Mozart and the Haydn, he said, I cannot possibly aspire to anything like this. And he gave up writing his first symphony. It took him another 5 years before he summoned up the effort to do it, which is quite striking, really. Okay, so these are the works that put Beethoven off writing symphonies, but fortunately for posterity, he came back to it later. I hope that my words and my examples have again opened that window into Mozart's world. Thank you very much indeed.